All right, everyone. I think we'll be starting soon. Thanks a lot for turning up. I'm one of the organizers for this debate, but on other weeks, what I organize is the Molotov Seminar. It's so I'll spend the first 5 minutes shamelessly advertising Molotov Seminar, and then we'll let the debate begin. So the Molotov Seminar is something that started just between me and my friends because we would hang out at bars and go to trivia, and then we would end up talking about all sorts of stuff. And usually my friends would also be physics PhD students, but we would end up most of the time talking about all sorts of other stuff. So I kind of decided that maybe it was a good idea to have a more structured platform for us to come together and talk about ideas, because people cannot really be bracketed into the discipline that they're studying, and oftentimes they have very rich and interesting ideas about the rest of the world, and they think about things outside of their academics. So that's how the Molotov Seminar started. It started in the last summer, and last week we had our 31st seminar, and although it started inside the physics graduate department, it eventually spread outside the department, and we have had all sorts of talks. So we host one talk weekly, Friday evenings at 5. So today's debate is replacing the weekly Molotov Seminar. And we have had talks about all sorts of stuff. So we have had talks about science, philosophy, religion, economics, music. So I try to keep this as informal as possible. And it's not affiliated to the university or anything. It's just an informal space for people, for students to come and talk about anything they want. So if you want to turn up to the weekly Molotov seminars and hear what other students have to say, all you have to do is, if you're on Facebook, just type Molotov Seminar on Facebook, and whichever profile comes up, just add it on your profile, and then you'll be invited to the weekly events. If you are not on Facebook, you can still find Molotov Seminar on Facebook, and on the bio on the left, it's going to send you to a different link to sign up for email notifications. If you have a QR code reader on your phone, you can scan that right now, and it will send you to that to the online form if you don't have Facebook. And if you do have Facebook, just go on Facebook and search Molotov Seminar. So a while back, a couple of friends and I decided that do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah.
Can you explain the name of the story?
The
story of the name.
The story of the name. So there was a pre-existing group of students who met every once in a while, and they wanted to discuss interesting ideas that they had been working on in theoretical physics and math. And it was called the Whiskey Seminar. And I'm not making, like, this is off the record, but sometimes they did enjoy whiskey during the seminars. So when I started thinking about this, I thought, okay, what's going to be a catchy name of an alcohol? You don't drink Molotov cocktails, but it's explosive and it's interesting. And so, yeah, so that's how I came up with that name. Subsequently, there was another seminar that was kind of organized for a while. It was called the Beer Seminar, and so that's the general theme of. Yeah, and the other interesting part is this logo is not something that I made. It's the logo of a Brazilian beer or something that I stole from the internet. And these days, if you do an image search using this image, you get Molotov Seminar and not that beer company. So I'm waiting for a phone call from Brazil any day now. Okay, so that's the story behind Molotov Seminar. So a couple of friends got together and decided we might want to have a debate, and we plan to try and make this an event, a continuing event per semester. So this is our first venture, and thanks a lot for turning up. And I'll give the floor over to the participants and the moderator. Thanks.
Hi everyone. I'm Shiva, and I'll be the moderator for today. So I request all of you to either turn your cell phones off, put them on silent, whatever you like. And so basically the format for today's debate is sort of like the intelligence squared debates, if any of you have seen them. Every participant will start off with an opening statement for about 3 to 4 minutes. We'll alternate between the two sides. And later we'll open up the floor for audience questions and responses from the participants. Then we'll have closing statements towards the end. Okay? That's the general format. And we did flip a coin before the show started, and it turns out Maria will be going first. Okay? So let me introduce Maria Jose Bustamante Rosell, or Majo as we know her, is a physics grad student who hails from Peru. She used to previously study neutrinos. Now she studies dark matter based on the motion of galaxies. Among other things, she likes taking down kites for fun. And note that her name sounds like Mao. Okay? So let's see what she has to start. Maria.
Thank you, Shiva. That was a generous introduction. Okay. Oh. Okay. So I want to be brutally honest here. I don't really know what qualifies me more than any of you to be sitting in this side of the room. Now, that being said, by that same argument, I don't know of anything that really disqualifies me. So, I do believe I'm supposed to give an opening statement. So, here I go. Jesus said that it's easier to feed a camel through the eye of a needle than to feed a rich person through the gates of heaven. Now, we all want to go to heaven. In a capitalist system, though, we're also all motivated to be rich. Hence, capitalism works against our own best interests. I'm happy now because I got a chance to play my April Fool's jokes in front of the audience. That was amazing. You don't breathe now, especially you. Okay. If I'm allowed to be a little more serious. Okay. So I believe that economy is a part of human activity that is concerned with extraction, production, and allocation of resources. And humanity has had and keeps thinking of different ways to address this. Feudalism, anarchism, anarcho-capitalism, socialism, communism, capitalism itself, right? When we ask ourselves, is there a better alternative to capitalism? I guess there's also a question of what do we want to be better, right? What do we prioritize over what? Are we thinking in terms of society, individuals as consumers, in terms of the things that society produces and are consumed? Thinking of the best way to extract and produce things, or thinking of the best way to allocate these things to satisfy everyone's needs. I don't think there's a doubt that capitalism is very efficient at extracting and producing things. We live in a nation which, unlike any other, for once we produce food to feed 1.5 times everyone on the planet. That being said, it's also a nation which more than 14% suffer from chronic malnutrition. So the thing is, in the balance between offer and demand, or supply and demand, Spanglish there, capitalism has been praised as a system that's better at meeting the two of them. And it seems to me that where there's one and the ability to pursue this one, capitalism is actually quite good at it. Remarkably good even at generating new ones. But the very fact that there is such a thing as 40% of the population not being able to satisfy their, not even want, their need for food. And there's something about this inequity of individuals on the side of the demand that seems to be also at fault with the statement of supply and demand being best met in capitalism. what may be a better alternative to satisfy the meaning of supply and demand are things that are being thought of, and actually I do bless my friend Ben here for actually having more to say about it, specifically about new alternatives that are being thought. And on a whole other different angle, again, when we are trying to answer the question, is there a better alternative to capitalism? We could also think, are we thinking in terms just of society, individuals, not anymore as consumers, but as producers? You know, in terms of how we conduct our lives to relate, and how we relate to others due to this form of production, as part of this form of production. And what I mean to say is, economy is not just an isolated system, even for a system that excels at production, extraction, and allocation. Even for a system that would do that, not saying that it does, but even if it did, one might also ask if it is better in terms of the effects that it causes on individuals that work under that system, on their relationships and on the environment. And I think there's a lot to be said about that as well. There's also, finally, the question of whether capitalism is actually now and will continue to be, if uncontrolled, a very efficient way to produce things. The thing that capitalism is remarkably good for is increasingly concentrating wealth among fewer hands. And the aside that generates an unhealthy imbalance of power that does go against the very best things that capitalism is praised for. Mainly the betterment of technologies for production and extraction of goods under the pressures of competition. So, is there a better alternative to capitalism? I sure hope so. Because if it's not, I don't think it's ideal. And definitely, if left alone, I think it's actually a really bad alternative. But I guess that's what we're trying to debate. And it might be evident that that's my side, because I'm on the side of the table.
On the other side of the table, to your right, we have Jamie. Jamie is a physics grad student, and as such, he has extensive experience pontificating on topics outside all his fields of expertise. He knows a little bit about economics, which includes how to correctly spell, and how to spruce up his arguments with descriptors of size, like macro, micro, nano, meso. He apologizes to any audience members who came in search of edification, because what he brings is more like comedy along the lines of Billy Madison, what he claims. And well, he doesn't look too nervous right now, so I guess he was in Crown and Anchor early this afternoon. So with that, Jamie.
I didn't make it to Crown. So I wrote this stuff down, because otherwise I'll get way off track. Let's see here. This is really going to be kind of a thesis in 3 parts. So part 1, economic activity is not a zero-sum game. Trading unevenly distributed resources not only increases overall wealth, but generally benefits all parties. A common caricature of trade involves a rich capitalist kind of like shaking this poor guy upside down to get all the pennies out. And this happens, but I'm going to argue that it's a preventable exception. And that an ideal economy is one that allocates resources in such a way as to maximize overall utility. Furthermore, I'm going to argue that this optimal state can be achieved by giving individuals the freedom to act in their own best interests. So that's part 1. Part 2, because it depends on pairwise comparisons of utility, optimizing resource distribution gets exponentially more complicated as the system size grows. So for a small village, maybe a few smart people with everyone's best interests at heart can really top-down engineer the economy. But for a large economy, this becomes pretty much computationally impossible and really impractical. Since many of us are physicists, I'm tempted to compare this to arranging gas atoms or molecules in a room. If your room is like 10 nanometers on the side, then you really could specify the position of every molecule and do a pretty good job of minimizing the free energy. But try doing that for a room this size. It's not theoretically impossible, it's computationally impossible. And similarly, for economies, my problem with top-down engineering and with price setting isn't a philosophical one. I think it's kind of a nice idea, but I think that in practical terms, it's almost impossible and certainly unfeasible. Let's see here. Lost my spot. Fortunately, as with for a gas, we don't have to tell each molecule where to go. Each individual atom does whatever the hell it wants to do, but the ensemble acts in a predictable, deterministic way. Similarly for economies, large groups of people acting in their own self-interest, which large groups of people always do, can establish a stable equilibrium for things like prices and resource allocation. And to kind of speak a little to what Maho said already, I'm not saying that this always happens, and certainly, just like in thermodynamics, you can get situations where wealth starts to accumulate in big puddles at the bottom, or just like in condensation, you don't always get completely uniform distributions of particles or of wealth. You can have symmetry breaking, but I'm going to argue that that's an avoidable condition. And I don't know how long I can keep that analogy going, so I'm going to try not to stretch it. And then the third point almost puts me like over on the other table. I said that the free market works because large groups of people act in their own self-interest on average. And for exactly that reason, any society of non-assholes has to take policy steps to protect people who need protection. So from an economic planning perspective, this involves first preventing that symmetry breaking where wealth condenses into big piles. But it also involves safety nets, direct redistribution of wealth to people who don't start with the same resources. Because not everybody does. Like the first cartoon of trade involves like, I've got all the peanut butter and he's got all the jelly, but somebody over here may not have anything. And so there's an initial redistribution of wealth, not resources, that needs to take place. Furthermore, some components of society, like fire departments, police forces, education systems, healthcare, are so crucial that top-down control is totally warranted, even though there's a good chance that it reduces the financial efficiency of these components. But we can't afford the risk of losing them, and so a little bit of financial inefficiency is worth the certainty that the resources will be there for everybody. So to summarize, man, this went longer than I expected. In a perfect world, resources and wealth would be distributed pretty evenly, and we would all live happily ever after. In reality, goods and services must be traded to correct imbalance. This trading process generally benefits all parties, but optimizing prices and resource allocation gets arbitrarily complicated in large systems. Fortunately, the task can be crowdsourced by allowing everyone to act in their own best interest. Instead of planning an entire economy, the government's role is then relegated to the tails of the bell curve, preventing condensation of wealth into large pools and protecting those without resources. That's it. Thanks.
So after Jamie, back over on the other side of the table, we'll have Ben. So Ben grew up near Houston and moved to Austin for college in 2002. He first earned a bachelor's in anthropology from UT and an MA in international relations from Boston University in 2009, before he returned to UT again to study physics. Ben likes watching movies, reading, writing, and also playing the guitar. For all of us here, we also just got to know that Ben is getting married next month. Let's have Ben.
Okay, thank you. The question is posed, is there a better alternative to capitalism? At the end of his documentary, Capitalism, A Love Story, the director Michael Moore says, and I'm paraphrasing, we have to eliminate capitalism and replace it with something that works for all people. and that something is called democracy. In a nutshell, that's my response to the question posed. I think that the more decisions are brought under democratic control, the better off we will all be. It's a common assumption that the collapse of the Soviet Union demonstrates the futility of any alternative to capitalism. In fact, that's been a popular slogan among the powerful, TINA, T-I-N-A, there is no alternative. After the Soviet Union collapsed, political scientist Francis Fukuyama wrote a famous article, The End of History, where he says we may have reached, quote, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution, with the supposed triumph of Western economic and political liberalism. I think history will prove these proclamations premature. No doubt there are many lessons to be learned from the collapse of the Soviet Union, but whether a large-scale democratic economy is viable is not among those lessons. I think we should struggle for a democratic economy because capitalism is both unjust and inefficient. Examples of its injustice are income distribution and relationships of dominance and submission. Income goes overwhelmingly to owners and managers, not the people who do the actual work, and any capitalist economy will be permeated with coercive relationships between people who own the capital and resources and those who have little choice but to take orders from the owners. The market mechanism is inefficient in various ways, mostly in an allocative sense. For example, in the form of asset bubbles and a tendency for companies to merge and create a non-competitive business environment. One of the most important inefficiencies of the market mechanism comes from external effects, or externalities, which are basically hidden costs not accounted for in transactions. The likely enormous costs of environmental destruction and climate change, for example, are not accounted for in most market transactions that contribute to these problems. Arguments for the viability of alternatives to capitalism can be based on both theoretical proposals and real-world experiments in collective ownership and democratic management. Regarding experiments in economic democracy, one ongoing experiment in cooperation is the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation operating in the Basque region of Spain since 1956. It's grown into a complex of over 100 cooperative enterprises involved in various industrial, service, financial, distribution, educational, and research activities. The workforces own cooperatives and elect their managers. The MCC, the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, is the dominant economic power in the Basque region, much more important than, say, GM would have been to, like, Detroit, as the way one person put it. And it even has its own bank that links the enterprises together. As of 2011, it had 33 billion euros in assets. The MCC may be internally cooperative, but of course it still must compete in a market-oriented environment and is subject to pressures associated with that. Regarding theory, various ideas have been proposed. I'll just mention a system that I happen to be a little bit familiar with, a proposal by Michael Albert and Robin Connell called Participatory Economics, or Paracon for short. These are detailed proposals, so if you're interested, I recommend Albert's book called Paracon. Connell writes that the principles of a participatory economy are equity, meaning compensation according to effort and sacrifice, self-management, meaning decision-making power in proportion to the degree one is affected by a decision, and solidarity, meaning concern for the well-being of others. The major institutions they propose towards these ends are democratic worker and consumer councils, balanced job complexes, balanced in terms of sharing of desirable and unpleasant tasks, and a participatory planning procedure in which production and consumption are democratically organized in a non-market, iterative process of proposal and revision, with decisions being made by those in the best position to make them, the actual workers and consumers. Thanks.
Those are a bunch of interesting comments that brought about a lot of things that we'll get to during audience questions and rebuttals. Last up in the list of opening statements, we'll have Alex. Alex studied math and econ at the University of Chicago and has a particular interest in probability, statistics, econometrics, behavioral economics, economic development, and also criminology. I don't know how they correlated, but sure. He's interested in the evaluation of evidence, evaluation of risk, and decision theory, and he currently works in the field of data analytics for Mu Sigma in Austin. So, Alex.
Hello. Good evening, everybody. So, why do I think there is no better alternative to capitalism? So this comes down to I think there are a few primary, fundamental reasons that arguments against capitalism typically fail to address. The first has to do with incentives. People have an incentive to maximize their own well-being. They work for themselves, maybe their family, a few close friends, but nobody tends to have incentives to work for, to make decisions that are in the interest of other people. So if you have a politician or a bureaucrat or even a democratically elected cooperative, their incentive is not to improve the well-being of individual people. Their incentive is to improve their own standing. And also, typically when proposals are, or policies are implemented or proposed, the actual incentives and the actual effects and the unintended effects tend to be ignored. There's sort of this very simplistic behavioral assumption. So incentives are one thing. People have an incentive, not really intelligent. And you can see this in the way that bureaucracies often are set up to try to implement programs. People who are running them don't have an incentive beyond perhaps their own altruism in order to make sure that the programs actually work, actually accomplish the sometimes very noble goals. But the incentives aren't there, and so you have no reason to expect people to behave in the way you want them to behave. Another is information, as my partner touched on. You also do not have the information to make good economic choices for other people. Nobody can look inside your mind and say, okay, this is the amount that they're willing to pay for these goods. These are the goods they want. That's just impossible. And of course, there's also computation. You can't have any sort of top-down planning, no matter how much democracy is involved or computers are involved, that can coordinate an economy of billions of people. Really, the whole world is connected. It will be very soon. Counting billions of people, you're planning everything. And also, again, as my partner mentioned, you have specialization in trade. So when people are allowed to freely exchange with each other, this leads to trade and to specialization, which is one of the primary drivers of economic development over the course of all of human history. If you're more interested in that topic, I recommend The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley. And then finally, I guess the third major point is that the question specifically asks, is there a better alternative? It does not ask if capitalism is perfect, or if people cannot find either theoretical or empirical flaws with the approximations to capitalism that have been implemented. Rather, we're asking if there's something that is an improvement. And simply pointing out that there's some flaw in the capitalist system, with all capitalist systems even, does not imply that there's some better alternative. First, you have to show that it's actually a result of capitalism, not people attempting to meddle. I think many of the problems already been mentioned are largely due to attempts to fix those problems or other problems. And in addition, you then have to show that whatever you're proposing is going to actually be an improvement. And this is the part that people sort of skip, like, okay, well, there's this problem, so we're going to do something to solve it. I don't think that's quite valid. You can't just say, oh, there's a problem, we have a solution that seems like it should fix it, or to ignore the unintended consequences. Like with a particularly annoying example to me is environmental regulations. They're very strong regulations about what you can do on your land if there's endangered species that are found there, or if there's wetlands found there, to the point where, let's go back to what we were talking about, incentives. People who find wetlands or endangered species on their property have no incentive to report those because then they can't do anything. Their incentive is to destroy any evidence that it was ever there and drive out the endangered, kill the endangered species or fill in the wetlands, whatever, before it can be found. So that is just one example of this counterproductive response. Those attempting to solve some sort of a problem and make it worse. So actually showing that you have an improvement, and again, also taking into account the fact that it may be the case that of 100 attempted improvements, 90 turn out to be worse or don't improve. That is sort of like there's some other negative effect somewhere else. sort of balance out, maybe the last 10 have a negative net positive effect. So you can't just only take those 10 and say, okay, well, see, we did really well. No, you have to take into account the fact that a lot of your attempts at implementing these policies might fail. So that's where I think people really jump the gun on saying that you come up with an improvement to capitalism.
Thank you. So, I think before we begin the debate aspect of this, Alec brings up a good point where we can't just start pointing out flaws with capitalism if we want to discuss better alternatives. Okay? So just to make sure we have a good platform for discussion, I invite Alex to give a short summary of what we can take as a working model of capitalism to decide whether any change will be an improvement or not. So could you quickly summarize what you would take as the basic tenets?
The basic tenets of capitalism, in my opinion, would involve free trade, free movement of people and information. People own property. Most disputes are resolved through contracts and negotiations that way instead of by a top-down approach. People make their own economic decisions. These are what I would consider the primary key aspects. You do not have any sort of something from the top of the government implementing winners and losers in the economic system, doing price and wage controls, these sorts of things.
Thank you. Okay, so we've set up a platform, lots to debate on. Do the audience members have any questions to any of the speakers based on what they asked? Yes.
One of the questions that I have is the current model that we have, like for governments, none of them are like 100% either or. So when they're talking about like better alternative to capitalism, are they talking about like the ideal or the current systems that we have in reality, which are 100% capitalist or socialist or anything else?
So could you summarize the essence of your question? Are we talking about ideals today? Or
when they're talking about better alternative to capitalism, we're talking about the idyllic capitalist, like 100%, or are we talking about what's actually being implemented in like the world today?
would one of you guys want to answer that?
Sure. I can say that you won't catch me defending like total invisible hand, like free market, peasants falling under cartwheels and stuff. Like I won't defend that. Maybe Alex wants to. But that's totally a fair question.
One of you guys?
I think it's a very good question. My initial kind of thinking when I just read the question was whether we were going to talk about what's better than what actually exists. It doesn't surprise me that our opponents would want to defend the actual system that exists. I guess I'm assuming most people would agree that it has severe flaws. So to me, I think I'm assuming that it's more what you guys are interested in to think about if there's a better alternative to what actually exists, rather than debating some kind of an abstract theory. That's my position on that. I don't know.
I think just about everyone here will agree that what we have today is somewhere in the middle. The question is the way to improvement moving one way or the other? Okay? And that, I think, is where the two sides will greatly differ on. Like Alex gave a bunch of tenets of capitalism, like say the free market, or a lack of regulation, and so on and so forth, maybe structuring incentives properly or not trying otherwise. And I think the two different sides will argue that the way to improve the current situation is to head in opposite directions on each of these tenets.
Yeah, so there obviously are, even of the most capitalist or historically capitalist countries in the world today, there's lots of non-capitalist policies that have been implemented. And so I think the best way to solve a lot of the problems people bring up is actually more capitalism, not less, to identify problems that are caused by these interventions.
Okay. Yes, question.
I was just saying, I haven't heard an alternative yet.
Okay.
I've heard about the Basque region, which is smaller than Houston.
Okay.
That's all I've heard.
So, would one of you like to comment on that?
Well, the world is basically capitalist today. I mean, there are no large-scale alternatives that are present in the world today. I mean, we all know that, I assume. So if you're going to ask the question, is there a better alternative, then I think necessarily we are going to be talking about imagining, to some extent, I think we're going to be talking about imagining to some extent what better alternatives might look like, what kinds of problems with the capitalist system we might be interested in fixing or improving. And I mean, I mentioned the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation because I think it's a very interesting example of exactly what I said. It's an interesting example of worker ownership, cooperative organization, and of course I also mentioned a theoretical proposal that's been made, which is actually quite detailed. I mean, if you're interested, I suggest you take a look at it. I won't even be able to give you the details because it is so detailed. But I think it's a serious proposal. I mean, I don't mean to be a spokesperson for it, but I do think that it is something that is detailed enough and thought out enough that it's worth considering as a possible alternative. But yeah, I mean, I think the basic answer is, I mean, there are no large-scale functional alternatives that I know of in the world today that are at least in some way capitalistic. Or I agree with the statement that most economies today are basically some kind of mixed economy.
So could I characterize your response as saying that the basic ways in which the organization that you took as an example differs from capitalism is in the sense that it has worker ownership and distributed decision making?
I suppose. I mean, I think some of the major. I mean, so like the
Could you elaborate a little bit more on the concrete aspects in which it's different?
Okay.
And
Well,
how it improves? Yes.
Well, so if you're talking about Paragon, I mean, the theoretical proposal that I mentioned is different in a couple of important ways. For one thing, I mean, the private ownership of major resources and productive infrastructure would not be privately owned. Those things would be under some form of democratic or collective ownership, which is not. I mean, in this country it might sound radical, but I mean, in many countries around the world, like oil reserves are owned by the government, for example. I mean, I think, you may or may not agree with this sort of an idea. I mean, obviously we've grown up in a capitalist society, we've been indoctrinated with it. We believe that it's just that we should be able to divide up the world and own it as individuals, but the fact is this leads to extraordinary concentration of wealth. I mean, there's a report that came out last year by Oxfam that basically concluded that 62 individuals, 53 of them are men, by the way, own as much wealth as the bottom half of the world, 3.5 billion people roughly. And this wealth is transmitted from generation to generation, and it ultimately comes about as a result of the private ownership of resources and productive infrastructure. I mean, that's just the way, I don't really see any way around that conclusion. You can try to, there are corrective measures you can take. There are regulations, there are progressive taxation systems and so on that you can take, but I don't think it eliminates the fundamental injustice. When an American CEO makes 300 times the amount of money that a bottom floor worker makes, I think that's an injustice. And even back in the 1960s, which some people would refer to as kind of the golden age of American capitalism, even then the CEO to worker ratio was about 20. In the Mondragon cooperative, the ratio is more like 3 to 5. So I think that's more just, and I think that those are features of a better economy.
Yeah. So there's a few points I wanted to make. One is that if you wanted to have a worker-owned company, is there a reason you couldn't have that in a capitalist system, or somebody estimated that if all the workers in the United States saved a chunk of their income every year, they could buy out every company on the New York Stock Exchange in like a decade or two. And that would be something that would be completely fine under capitalism. And it hasn't happened yet. Maybe the socialists in the United States should know that. But that is something that can happen. You know, there are already in the United States worker-owned companies. They may or may not do well. I'm not sure, but they're free to compete. And if they do better, then they'll continue to prop. There'll be more of them. And then we were talking about so wealth inequality is actually one of those things that I think a lot of attempts at fixing the wealth inequality has led to more of it, or it's been an unintentional result of all their policies. Like you have all these regulations on various businesses and various industries, hundreds of thousands of pages from the federal government alone in the United States. And what that does, it makes it harder for new companies to form. Oftentimes the bureaucracies are captured, something called regulatory capture. The regulatory bodies are captured by the vested interests, the interests that already exist. And so they implement these regulations and codes that make it very expensive to start a new company and get going, whereas they can write the laws in favor of themselves. They can just pay some lawyers to fill out paperwork. So that's like one of the things that contributes to this increase in inequality. As far as the Oxfam report in particular, there's a kind of odd way to calculate where debt is included as negative wealth. And there may be good reason for that, but it means that somebody would say in the United States with a high income that took out a mortgage to pay their house is counted as having large negative wealth. And so if you have a bunch of people who are doing fine but counting as negative wealth, it's going to really skew the results of something like this. I had to read that paper too. And it doesn't really exactly tell you what you necessarily think it does.
But then, most of the people in the bottom half of the world are people who I can assume would not have a large negative debt.
Yeah, I mean, a significant fraction of those people who have the least wealth are those, like I said, people who have a, maybe not large, but a non-trivial income, are able to live in a reasonable house in a developed country or an apartment, feed themselves, and not necessarily suffer from malnutrition, they don't suffer from crippling poverty.
So are you claiming that that is a significant fraction of the $3.5 billion that Ben referred to?
It's a significant thing is because they have negative wealth. So if you have like a large number of people with a small positive wealth, and then one person who has a bunch of negative wealth, they sort of cancel it if it's zero. Like I have more wealth than most of the United States because I don't have debt. That's just the way that this accounting is done. There might be good reason for it, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what you think it does.
Any other questions? Yes.
Does that report not count like the equity that you have from owning a home or something as well?
It's still going to be negative unless you've paid off most of it.
Any other questions? Yes.
When you say, is there a better alternative to capitalism, how would you guys define better? Is it more freedom? Is it standard of living? Is there anything that you feel is important in your definition of better in this discussion?
I think the speakers addressed that quite a bit in their opening statements, but why don't you like to repeat, Maho, and summarize what you think could be the axes along which the new system would be better?
Well, I mean, I guess I asked myself the same question, right, at the beginning. And that's.
Well, can everyone hear Maho?
I guess I asked myself the same question at the beginning. That's how I started, and I think that I'm not necessarily sure if we think of it in the same terms, right? Is it better in terms of being able to produce more things, or be a better attractive economy, produce more things, or is it better in terms of allocating these resources and making sure that everybody has what they need, right? I think that specifically about what we just discussed, right, with like the Oxfam data, I actually, I mean, even if that is not taken into account, we can't negate the fact that wealth is highly concentrated on the 1% or 0.1% or 0.01%.
I mean, I think inequality is basically irrelevant, and standard of living is basically what's important. Like, if everyone has nothing, then we are in fact all entirely equal, and yet I'd rather live in a place where I have my same lifestyle and a bunch of people live
limited futuristic reply, you know, in post-scarcity Star Trek universe, than one in which everyone is starving to death.
So, can I respond? Yes, Ben.
There's actually interesting data on this. I've been studying it for a separate reason. I just happen to be aware of it. But I take exception to that statement. I mean, there is actually good research showing that inequality actually has a very severe impact on human health. This has been shown, for instance, in the Whitehall studies, which were done in Great Britain. Richard Wilkinson has done work on this, showing that if you have a hierarchical structure where there's rich people at the top and poor people at the bottom, and they perceive themselves as being poor, they will actually have a shorter lifespan statistically. And the Whitehall study was a study of thousands of people that went on for decades. It's a very, it was a famous study when it came out. These kinds of hierarchical structures where wealth is concentrated at the top have a health gradient that actually goes down the hierarchy. Those at the top of the hierarchy have the longest lifespan, statistically, of course, and those at the bottom have the shortest. It's a very robust result. They've looked at other features of their lifestyles. Do they smoke? What kind of a diet do they have? Do they exercise? And these things only explain a fraction of the effect. The rest of the effect seems to be explained by the actual perception that they are disadvantaged in their society. And this is actually interesting because it doesn't even matter. I mean, it's actually like take Greece, for example. Greece is a much more poor country than the United States. But even in Greece, the poor people there, the overall health outcomes in Greece are better than the ones in the United States, but the effect is still there. The poor people in Greece still have a shorter lifespan than the rich people in Greece, even though overall they have, even though overall it has a worse, I kind of lost my train of thought, but there is decent research on this, and it's also been extended into primates. I mean, Robert Sapolsky has also done research on this with primates, and it shows basically the same effect. At the bottom of the social hierarchy, it shortens your lifespan. It's related to things like stress and the perception of your own disadvantage. And so I think it's an important.
We'll come back to that later. Other questions?
So I actually had an idea on a better alternative to capitalism, and I wanted your thoughts on it. What do you think of guaranteed minimum income? Because it addresses the problem of the incentive that you talked about earlier, but it also addresses the problem of inequality. So what are your thoughts on that?
Who wants to go for this? I'll go for it. Okay.
So can you repeat the question?
Oh, yes. So the question was on guaranteed minimum income, because it seems to address the problem of inequality while also addressing the problem of incentive. Okay.
Yeah, so I actually think that's a really nice idea, but I don't think it is necessarily exclusive with capitalism. I think that you could have a capitalist economy, and it's kind of, I think that you could have a capitalist economy with a sort of safety net that was basically, we're a productive enough society that there's enough wealth in, for example, the U.S. economy that you really could implement that. And people who didn't want to work or were incapable of working wouldn't have to. It wouldn't necessarily solve inequality, but it would maybe allow the poorest in society to live with a level of dignity that I think the lack of which is really responsible for that, for the Whitehall Study. I think that it's a social effect and a stress effect much more than a financial one. And so, like, for example, and Alex kind of alluded to this, if we lived in a far more unequal society than we do now, and my lifestyle was the same, but there were lots and lots of people making, 6, 7 orders of magnitude more money than me, I don't think I'd care, and I don't think I'd die sooner either. So I don't think that inequality is necessarily the most important thing to address. But it is, it's a symptom of an unjust society, and certainly we think of it as a fairness issue. And when it's impossible for somebody to work like eight orders of magnitude harder than another person. I mean, unless you work zero amount, right? And then you can then the ratio can be arbitrary. But for somebody who's working a 40-hour week, there's no such thing as working like 10 to the 8 times harder than that. But there are people who make that much more money. Anyway, so that I think is we read as an injustice, and that can add stress to a person's life, which is certainly correlated with disease and earlier death. But to get back to the point, I think that a minimum income, essentially an allowance for anybody, no matter what they contribute to society, is something that we can afford now. And I think it is. I think it's not something that contradicts the tenets of capitalism.
Okay, I would gather that both of you are in agreement with what Jamie said, or would you disagree with anything he said? Would you like to respond? If you disagree.
I mean, I think it could be a useful corrective in some way, but I wouldn't, as a rule, advocate a minimum, like a guaranteed minimum income. I don't think. I mean, I guess I might actually have some common ground with Alex on the idea of incentives. I mean, like I said, I think it could possibly in some situations be a just corrective. But I mean, I think like in a society like a more ideal society, like maybe the Paracon society that I mentioned, income would be based on like how hard you work. I mean, if you're like a minimum guaranteed wage, I guess might like apply for someone who's unable to work, for example. But
any other comments? Hang on, before we move on to other comments.
Yeah, I was just going to make a brief comment. So I think I can talk about this for a long time, but
please keep it short.
Yes. So basically, the fact that some people, or it seems that some people need assistance, is I think a symptom of a problem that capitalism has resulted in completely unprecedented improvements in living standards across all of human history, just in the last 200 years. But obviously, there are still people living in capitalist or basically capitalist societies who are still poor and maybe need some help. But I think that so I'm going to say that capitalism is necessary but not sufficient. You do need to have a social structure, and I think if you have a social structure that can help take care of people, people choose to take care of their neighbors and other people around them. That's much better than trying to impose sort of a minimum wage or this minimum basic income, which just papers over the symptoms. Like there's a reason that some people are well off and some people are less well off, and if you could find a way to help really raise the whole living standard of this group of people without just giving them money. I mean, it's a testament to how ineffective I think top-down solutions generally are, that just giving people money is a better solution than what we've been doing for the last 40 years. And I do think it would be less bad than we have now. But it sort of papers over the fact that there's a lot of things that cause, well, I don't know if the phrase cause poverty, because poverty is natural, wealth is unnatural. So a lot of things that cause some people to be wealthy and others not. And I'd like to actually address those causes, like if you have a percentage of the population, whether they're victims of something or their own choices or combination, you should improve that.
Okay, I saw a question here.
I thought the idea of wage is about getting payment for the work you do. So I thought her point was about a minimum wage, not about giving off people handoffs just for not doing anything, right?
So
No.
would you clarify the basis of your question?
Guaranteed minimum income is a concept where you give a certain amount of money to all citizens of the country, regardless of what they make. And what this implies is that there is no incentive gap. So it doesn't mean that if you're unemployed, then you get this money. So it doesn't have the negative impacts of that.
So in general, thanks for the clarification. So in terms of, the way I see it is a minimum wage about, for a certain amount of work you have a minimum wage based on the standard of living in that country or in that neighborhood or whatever social structure you have, so that a person can survive. So what are your thoughts about how capitalism supports that idea versus how an alternative to capitalism will or will not support the idea and so on? Can you guys debate on that topic a bit?
So that's an interesting and pretty timely question. Some of you might be aware, maybe most of you, that both California and New York recently voted to increase minimum wage to $15 over in a phased introduction. So can I have comments on this from any speakers? Who wants to go first?
I can go. I think this is pretty brief for my position. Like I would file that under corrective measures to address problems that are inherent in capitalism. So I think it is kind of natural for the richest in a capitalist society to exploit their power, and things like the minimum wage and even a minimum income for all citizens, I think would be filed under how do we keep people from being destitute in our society. For me, capitalism is really the engine for producing wealth. It's not the philosophical approach to how wealth should be distributed.
One of you guys?
On the question of the minimum wage.
If you have any comments.
Well, I mean, I think there definitely should be a minimum wage, absolutely. People, I mean, if you look at the history of this, I mean, it came about as a result of popular struggle. In the 19th century, when the kind of early factories were coming into existence, I mean, I can't say that in every single situation it was like super exploitative, but I mean, I think we probably all heard the stories of people who worked, long hours in factories in dangerous conditions for little pay and so on. And this led workers to unionize, to form groups that they could have bargaining power and be able to interact with the owners and the management and be able to win better working conditions and win more fair pay. So yeah, I think some kind of a minimum wage and a $15 minimum wage or whatever it is, that is enough to guarantee somebody enough to get by on. I mean, I think that's just in a capitalist economy, but I don't believe in a capitalist economy. So I would say that in a future economy that's more just, the question wouldn't even arise, because the profits from an enterprise would be divided equally among the workers. And there would, if the enterprise wasn't making enough money to support those workers, then I don't know why they'd be doing that enterprise. But yeah, I mean, in our system, the reason why we need a minimum wage is because so much of the income goes to the top, and it's in the interests of the owners and managers to pay the workers as little as they possibly can. So you have to have. I mean, I think it's necessary just for purposes of social justice to have some kind of a minimum wage.
Yeah, I definitely have to respond, because minimum wage is a good example, very good example of the fact that it's just so completely atrocious and counterproductive, like absolutely terrible policy. Highlights a lot of things I've been saying. It makes it, so it doesn't cause all people who are making small amounts of money to make more. It causes some of them to make more and some of them to lose their job, because the person who's paying them can no longer afford to pay them. The real solution would be to improve the horrific government-run education system, take it as a government entirely, so it doesn't run poorly, and then people can have some actual skills. But having a low minimum wage, no minimum wage allows people who don't have high skills the ability to go in a program and make $100,000 a year, start earning skills that don't require them to invest. Like if you're all, most of us here, I'm a student, but you go to school, most of you are probably students, so somebody invested, is able to invest, so you'll gain skills, you'll have a higher wage after going to college than before. For people for which that's more difficult, for whatever reason, just too expensive, starting at a low wage is a very good way to develop skills and human capital. In addition, it just has this there's so many things I could go into it, but let me put it this way. In 1970s, people were advocating for a higher minimum wage in the United States to help the poor, particularly blacks. And also in the 1970s, the South African apartheid racist government did the exact same policy, with the exact opposite intended outcome. And the reason for that is because it prevents the very people who are in the worst position from competing by offering to pay to work for less. Something similar was passed in I think in the 30s during the Depression, because African Americans were competing against white workers by offering to work for less. And so state governments have to pay all like government construction jobs a certain minimum amount. That varies by state, but it's pretty high. And that prevents African Americans from competing by offering to work for less.
So we've had two different comments on, like, or three different comments with their takes on minimum wage, and I would like to think of it as each speaker has sort of given a different situation where minimum wage works or doesn't work, and we will leave it to the audience to figure out which situation they think we're in today, okay? A question there.
Something that you mentioned about education that I deeply disagree with, first of all, but you can't privatize education and then expect people to be able to get one when they can't afford it. So from that, I want to ask a question. How do you feel about a government safety net where education is guaranteed through college, where healthcare is guaranteed, where housing is guaranteed, where paid leave is guaranteed, but without like a basic income, and where unions are strong and there's no need for a minimum wage because unions are able to negotiate? How would capitalists feel?
Could I ask in what sense is this substantively different from a guaranteed basic income?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So we had a question asking regarding basic income to everyone, right? So is there any sense in which the answer you seek is different from a sufficient basic income for everyone?
Yes, because when you have guaranteed education, you learn how to spend your money correctly, how to find a job that helps you. And yes, you can have a basic income for people who really need it, but you need the skills and you need also health and to be able to take care of your baby when you're at your job and you need to leave for 12 weeks and etc. So that is very important. And actually, they do in some countries in South America, they do this basic income, which is a good idea used in a different way, but in South America, they use it to keep the poor like down. So I think it's a good idea in a capitalist country. We're in a more enlightened society, but different from that.
So,
how do you feel about a government?
Okay, since we already talked about this, short responses from any of the speakers who wish to comment. If not, we can go to the next question.
Yeah, there's no short response because all these policies are, I mean, most of them have such far-reaching unintended consequences that trying to dive into them is like a fractal of stupidity, poor implementation, and trying to look at all the effects is like this outward fractal of, again, stupidity and bad implementation.
Any other questions? Yes.
Maybe we can talk about the problem of monopolies in a capitalist system.
Okay, so Ben mentioned, I think, non-competes because of mergers, and I guess you're alluding to monopolies. So would one of you have a comment on this?
Yeah, just super quickly, because Ben also mentioned it in his opening statement, and I kind of meant to get to it. I think that monopolies are one of many problems with the capitalist system, but even just as evidenced by the United States' legislative history, you can do a lot from the top to prevent monopolies from appearing. And it's certainly true that the larger a company gets, the more unevenly wealth becomes distributed. So I think that legislation is certainly called for to keep us from moving towards one gigantic company that basically like controls all of the business in a country or in the world even. And certainly there's a bit of a tendency towards that in capitalism, but I think it's preventable through legislation.
Yeah, I don't even think you necessarily need legislation. People point to monopolies or alleged monopolies or potential monopolies in United States history, but any time any of these companies try to exercise their monopoly power, they quickly found themselves outcompeted. And sometimes not even then. Like sometimes people will just start other competing companies. And maybe if they kept their price like at the competitive level anyway, and therefore didn't really have these negative effects, would be one thing. But especially today, it's so quick for people to come with new innovations, and the markets change so quickly that other companies will move in, like existing or new, and you don't necessarily need to. I don't think you really need. There's any real good reason to have this sort of anti-monopoly. But the other thing I would say is that if you're worried about monopolies, I mean, government's monopoly on violence, so I'm not sure why if you're afraid of monopolies, you're going to face monopoly in the law. Try to look at that.
So, 1 second, let me just... first, wait, we'll come back to you, Jim.
Okay. So I think, though, in general, if you make a good amount of resources, then the possibility to counter and create a company that's big enough to produce in that scale, right, and uses new technologies, it's probably going to be really hard and going to go harder and harder as the resources become increasingly prohibitive for just a small company to acquire.
Jim?
Yeah, so I just thought of a little corollary what I was saying before, and I should have said it right away. One of the really important points in this discussion is that big companies and maybe people with money in general need to be prevented from exercising disproportionate political power, because that's a really important way that they skew the system in their favor.
I think that goes to Ben's original point about democracy and distributed decision making. Sort of alludes to that. So, do you have a comment?
Well, I mean, I take some issue with the idea of the government as a monopoly. I see the point, but I mean, we do live in a formally democratic society where we are, at least in theory, able to participate in the government and have some kind of a say in what goes on. Depicting the government as if it's some kind of a monopolistic corporation is, I think, a pretty skewed idea of reality. But I mean, I would just question, the other side and ask, I don't think there's much denying that many of the industries in the United States today are basically oligopolies. I mean, there's a number of industries where there are a few large firms that dominate those industries. That's a factual situation. I mean, I suppose I guess I would just pose that question and ask, what they propose to do about it, or response.
Well, yeah, you don't need that many companies to still have competition. I can assure you that my clients and their 2 or 3 biggest competitors are probably 90% of the United States market in what they sell, but they still compete ferociously with each other. None of them can be said to have any sort of monopoly power.
Yeah. So Ben claims that there are industries where companies have monopoly power. Alex disagrees. Do you want to give an example of one specific market where?
Well, I think I just read something online about how the media in this country is basically dominated by 6 large companies. I guess you could argue that that's enough to have a competitive environment, but to me that doesn't seem like that also doesn't capitalist ideal that I've heard about. We have a lot of small businesses entering the arena with all their different ideas, and you have the ability to choose between something that you prefer.
That fact doesn't include anything related to the internet. No website is included in that, so it's only newspaper, TV, and radio.
Okay. So since you brought up the internet, how would you characterize the current internet service provider situation?
Is it a government-enforced monopoly? There's no reason logistically, like Google Fiber is moving into Austin, and there's no reason logistically that most places could not have multiple internet providers competing, but legally the government just mandates. That's really, if you want to talk about a monopoly in the United States, most of them are just government-mandated, government-run utility monopolies, government-mandated internet monopolies, phone line monopolies. Those are the monopolies in the United States, and they're all government-mandated.
So I see a question that's related to this.
So you raise a really interesting point about how a lot of these very, very large industries are dominated by a very small set of companies. And it's almost impossible for competition to genuinely arise. And you can posit two sorts of arguments for how this would happen. One, capitalism would naturally drift so that all of the resources are controlled by these five, and it's impossible to enter. Or two, these companies get large and then try a new strategy of exacting lobbying power in order to skew the rules so that they favor the winners already. So which of these arguments, I mean, it's clear which of you think is going to be doing that right now, but I'd like to hear you address the other argument, both of your sides.
Sorry, address what exactly?
So there's an argument that the small set of companies that we're observing are due to capitalism, where natural attrition of resources to the major few is you can't touch it, right? And then there's the other, where once you have a lot of resources, when you start shuffling resources.
So let's just stick to that one question, okay? So
the question is
yes,
is a comparison of these two approaches.
Okay.
So
Are you basically asking if the accumulation of wealth into a select few companies is due to like intervention in the political process, or if it's a natural feature of capitalism?
yeah, the second I have money to play politics, do I now guarantee myself like to be a winner in the capitalist game that I've rigged the rules to? Or is it that I'm simply playing the capitalist game better than anybody else?
That's a fair question. I think it's probably true that both things happen, but I don't think anybody would argue that once they start to accumulate wealth, a lot of the big players in the U.S. economy aren't above, lobbying as ferociously as possible to skew the playing field in their favor. And I don't think any of us supports that feature of the landscape either.
So, yeah, you're all going to agree on that, but now, can you make an argument against how capitalism would naturally break that down? Their point on that side. Yeah.
So for me, I think it kind of all comes back to this idea of getting money out of politics. I think the fact that rich people can lobby so effectively at all is pretty distressing, and I think that I don't have a proposal to put on the table for fixing that, but I think that that's something that any society, no matter what the economic model, needs to take a good look at.
Yes.
The outcome of lobbying is not because of capitalism, it's because of the existence of the government. So if you have less power to the government, I'm not saying I advocate it, then you would have less power to lobbying.
And that was Alex
Basically, my
Hirsch's argument.
solution, if the government doesn't have power to implement these regulations, then it's not a problem. Politics is not a problem.
Well, the other side of that is that you can have a more democratic government. I mean, you can have people actually organize themselves in order to claim their own democracy instead of like allowing rich people to lobby the government and control policy. I mean, we do have the ability. I mean, it would be difficult, but we do have the ability at least to come together and try to elect people who are not going to take money from corporations and who are not going to take money from rich lobbyists, and who are actually going to pass legislation that's in the interest of the population. I mean, that there is another side to that question.
Well, I mean, earlier you said that income.
Could you be a little louder, please?
Yeah, earlier you talked about how inequality wasn't necessarily pertinent, but I don't think you can get away from money and power being correlated in some way. That's always going to be true no matter what the system is. So in that sense, don't you think that reducing inequality is an important goal?
So to rephrase the question, it says, if you are running a market economy, then money equates to power. How do you separate a market from politics is the essence of this question, I would say.
Yeah, so my partner agrees it's a good question. Certainly, if you had no government regulations on being able to favor that rich corporations could use to curry favor, to improve their own position, or turn them against their intention. Even in that case, then yes, people having money would certainly have a certain amount of influence if you have a capitalist society where nobody can force you to do something, nobody can take wealth from you by force, then I'd say the power, no matter how much money you have, it's still inherently limited. There's only certain things that you can do with it. You might have influence, but you can't like directly control things the way that like a sort of top-down approach would.
Could you elaborate with an example?
An example of?
Where a lot of money does not give you much power.
So I mean, in all the, like I said, in all the cases in most countries you have today, you do have some ability to like lobby and gain power. So there's not like an example, but I mean, you could talk about like Rockefeller's competitors who got the government to go in and break up his monopoly. He didn't have the ability to stop that, no matter how much money he had.
So
maybe
just to make sure, I don't know. So just to make sure your argument comes out clearly. So you're saying that the reason, so if in an ideal capitalistic world without a government, monopolies would naturally be neutralized because money does not get you power. Is that the essence of your argument?
I mean, there's several reasons. I mean, it is certainly true that just having money or being in a good position in the market right now doesn't render you immune to market forces. I mean, ask Blockbuster, ask Kodak, ask any major company that's like been driven completely out by something new in the last couple of years. Ask anybody who's competed with Apple. Likely, it doesn't matter how established, no matter how established Microsoft was, Apple is still a major player. Yeah, question.
As far as like these alternatives, like the democratic economy, how the thing is like, if we're talking about just the United States, but the United States doesn't exist in a vacuum. So when we have things like minimum wage or something like that, we have the problem where markets go to other countries and then people just don't have jobs. So how do you implement these like new economies without factoring in that other countries might not play by those rules, and then you're kind of back to square one, probably in a worse situation because the other countries are like, well, we're still playing by the capitalistic rules, and then we come out like worse off.
It's a huge problem. I mean, the freedom to move capital across borders is one of the primary weapons that people with money and power have against democracy. When this happened recently in Greece, they elected a leftist government, but they had financial problems, and the international financial systems would not cooperate, and basically ended up forcing out the left government in Greece because they wouldn't cooperate with them on this financial level. In the post-World War II decades, there was a system, the Bretton Woods system, that did involve capital controls, so that it wasn't so easy to move money across borders. There were restrictions, but that's been deregulated, and now it's much easier to move money across borders and to essentially vote against government policy if you don't like it. So if your business doesn't like a government's policy, you can kind of have a negative effect on that economy by basically taking your money out of it. So I think it's a serious problem. I mean, I think the solution, to address your original point, is that you're going to have efforts from the bottom and from the top. You're going to have efforts. I mean, we happen to be extremely lucky in the fact that generations ago people fought to construct democratic institutions that we have some control over. We happen to live in that world. 300 or 400 years ago, there wouldn't have been a single institution that an ordinary person would have been able to participate in order to have any kind of an effect on their society. Now we live in a world where we actually do have that power, and we don't have to wage a war or a violent revolution to influence things anymore. We can vote, but you do have to actually organize, and you do have to actually have solidarity and things like that in order to make changes in the political system. But to address your point, I think it's going to take efforts from the bottom, building up new cooperative collective institutions, like maybe the Mondragon would be an example. But I think it's going to also take efforts to elect new politicians who will support these kinds of efforts and combat the greed and the concentration of wealth that comes out of the capitalist system.
So Ben's answer is to use the legislative framework, effectively.
Bottom and top.
Bottom, yeah. Okay. Yes, question.
So how would your democratic ideal prevent the flow of capital? Are you gonna enforce that?
Well, I mean, it was done. It was done in the Bretton Woods system. There were capital controls. I mean, you weren't able to move money across borders as easily.
Could you explain exactly how it was done?
I don't actually know exactly how they did it. I mean, I can.
In this world of freedom and democracy, you're going to prevent the flow of capital. That's your.
I mean, if you're talking about a short-term goal or a long-term goal, I mean, there's a difference. I mean, in a long-term goal, yeah, I mean, I don't think there probably would be any need for those kinds of controls. Those kinds of controls would be necessary in a world where you have big institutions who are capable of severely damaging an economy by moving their money across the border. If you can get rid of those institutions, then there wouldn't be any need for the legislation. So, I mean, that's a transitional measure that I'm promoting, not a final measure.
Yes. So part of the argument in Marxian theory is that you need capitalism as a precursor to an ideal society.
Sorry, what theory?
Marxian theory.
Marxist.
Yeah, Marxist, sorry. Because redistributing wealth when you have none makes everybody poor, but capitalism is the best system at creating wealth. So once capitalism has run its course, so to speak, then the people bring in a more justly distributed, I guess. So what I want to know is, what are your opinions on a time-varying view of capitalism? So like capitalism, it's very easy to look at capitalism right now and say, this is the best for what's happening right now. But as we look into the future and the past, so to speak, which one becomes better than the other?
Yeah, so I mean, I certainly don't think what we have now is the best. I think, hopefully that is clear. I hope that we can establish at least some places where you do have pretty, unrestricted capitalist economy, like places such as, I want to say places like Singapore and Hong Kong. Unfortunately, they restrict a lot of social freedoms, so I can't quite support them entirely. But how am I supposed to say this? I mean, I don't think that like Marx's view of how capitalism changes over time is even slightly legitimate. It's complete nonsense in my opinion. And you can see this because I don't know. So in science, which Marx claimed to be doing, the sort of standard is making testable, falsifiable predictions, and this is why creationism is not considered scientific, because anything that goes against your theory, you can say, oh, God did it. And so what Marx predicted was that you would have the most industrialized economies have this rapidly increasing inequality, concentration of wealth among a few capitalists, and that would lead to this mass, popular, spontaneous revolt in which people sort of spontaneously have this democratically organized system. And what the closest thing that's ever come to people trying to implement Marxist policies is a small group of educated middle-class people take over a country and then murder millions of people. So I think, on that sense, you can say to what extent the Marx made a prediction. And of course, the most industrialized countries just they continue to industrialize. The standard of living rose for all people. It was already rising when Marx wrote when Capital was published in 1848. It was already on the rise, and Marx sort of ignores a lot of things that were already happening in places like England and Germany. And so we've just seen this. I mean, there might be on by some statistical measure, just more inequality, more concentration of wealth. But I think people in the United States are pretty far from violently overthrowing the system. I know people who hang out in universities might not have this very good idea of what most of the United States thinks about this, but we're not about to hit a Marxist revolution. Sorry?
What's your upshot?
My upshot is that capitalism, you don't have to you're not going to, nor do you need some sort of like democratic Marxian revolution. and that capitalism, like I said, just with that low amount of regulation, minimal regulation, is just going to perform best over time. You don't need to have anything change. I mean, maybe if we ever get to the point where scarcity is a non-issue, and most of what we know about Star Trek replicators, and maybe most of what we know about economics becomes less relevant, we have to reevaluate, but we're not there, or the rare.
You want to respond, Mel?
So, I mean, you take that it was in the times of Marx, right? The economies that he was talking about actually provided, good work, provided through capitalism good work conditions, and I really think that there were generally,
Sorry? Oh, no.
I don't know.
Sorry, I was having trouble following. You say it again?
So you were saying that it was within the, you were saying that Marx predicted that, through his analysis of capitalism, it predicted that it would destruct itself, right? Self-destruct itself, would create the need for people for a revolution, and then people to actually, overcome that system. And you were saying, I think, that that was not the case with any of the, even during Marx's time, with any of the economies that he characterized as capitalist, right?
Yeah, so even in 1848, the most industrialized countries would be a place like England. And even by the time Capital was published, a lot of the issues that Marx brought up were actually being addressed. In order to make his point, he had to literally make up a lot of the data or focus on industries that were less industrialized.
I don't think that's true.
No, people have actually reviewed his data based on the original sort of government censuses that were taken, and his data doesn't match with.
Do you have a citation for that?
I can find one.
Okay.
Yeah, but yes, there were a couple of historians who looked into this, and basically a lot of the facts he claimed were just wrong.
So, since it seems to be a question of interest to the audience, maybe someone would appreciate if you could put that up on the Facebook page later.
Yeah, sure. I can cite the historians and at least one paper copy of a book that has this more descriptions.
Yeah, I guess, to specifically address what he was saying, I think that those societies actually did have a huge worker struggle that Marx addresses in that capital, and he actually, talks about how, syndicates and workers' associations worked against building a better situation for all of the workers, and I guess, improving in case the workers' conditions, but I don't think that was necessarily something that was an artifact of.
So to get back to the question that we started with, would you be okay with a time-evolving ideal system of economics or the way to organize production and distribution of resources? Or would you stick with one particular argument that stays constant in time? Would you want this to change over time, or just pick a set of rules and play by the same rules forever? I think that was the initial question, right?
It's less of time varying and more like it's a transition.
Right. So would you want to transition between different rules for economics, or just play within the same framework and say have the same system go along all the time? Or do you believe that it helps to have different frameworks, say capitalism or maybe some other framework at different points of time?
I believe that ideally one should eventually transition to something else.
Okay. Any other comments on that? Or any other questions? Yes.
So I was just going to make a comment about what you're saying, that 1847 England was the most industrialized country and there was no friction against capitalism. Well, England was practicing their capitalism in the colonies, and there were revolutions against their capitalism in the colonies. And all this inequality, the extreme inequality, that were manifested there, not in England, because everyone was there.
Yeah, so I didn't say there was no friction, but so colonies are not something that a capitalist does. Like a capitalist can't go to another country and just take it over with the military. That's something the government does.
I'm sorry.
Oh, so are we out of time?
No. Wait. I want to fact check you on that. First thing was done. Maybe you want to respond?
Right, by a quote-unquote private company that was owned by the monarchy.
That's exactly my point. It's East India Company, which
was owned by the monarchy.
colonies. It's not the government.
It was owned by the monarchy.
It was not
It
British
may not have been
government.
a part of the
East India
government, but
Company
it was founded by the monarch.
No,
It was run by the monarch.
It was made part of the government up when there was.
Okay, there's no way that a private company in the 15 or 1600s in Europe would have had the ability to take over another country militarily without the support of the government.
It became part of the government only in 1857, after the revolution.
Officially, but again, it was owned and run by the monarchy. Like, it may not have been an official part of the government, but they took this like money they got from being the monarchy and like invested it, and they sent government were there no. Was the British government not fighting the United States in 1776?
In that case, well, we have an impasse on the facts. So 2 more questions before we close up. So one in the back. You staying back?
The other thing we haven't talked about is, I'm wondering, does capitalism inherently produce this rampant consumerism that we have, and what can be done about that? Or is it inherent to capitalism?
Is consumerism inherent to capitalism?
So could you clarify exactly what the actual problem that you're asking about is? Consumerism is just kind of a vague term, so I'd like a little clarification.
Well, when you have this capitalistic system, and these companies, they're trying to make as much money as they can, so they have to make us buy as much as we can or cannot through taxes. That is a problem, right? So that is one problem. That is yet another problem I see.
So to summarize the question, in a bid to make more money, companies are incentivized to increase consumption. Is that good or bad, and does it need to be fixed? That's the essence of the question.
No, that is bad. I think we know that because of what is happening to the planet. But my question slash concern is that there is a problem with capitalism. So there is yet another reason for us to look for something else.
Any responses?
Well, I mean, I'm glad that you brought up something to do with the environment, because I don't know that we've actually talked about it too much yet. One of the things I mentioned in my initial remarks was the problem of externalities, and that's something I would be curious to hear the response to. I mean, when you go, and there are some who would argue that externalities are kind of like rampant, and they're basically everywhere. But there are very important externalities that are just kind of obvious. I mean, when you go to the gas station to fill your car with gasoline, you and the gas station both walk away from the transaction, perfectly happy. But then you go and drive your car and you burn the gasoline and you pump CO2 into the atmosphere. And that's going to have enormous costs. I mean, that's a real cost that's incurred by that transaction. Who's going to pay that cost? Well, I mean, we all are, and future generations are going to pay it. If the cost of that destruction had been included in the original price of the product, you might not have bought it. I mean, like the market actually might have functioned the way that it's intended to function, which is things that incur a high cost are priced high, and you don't want them because they're too expensive. So you might have made another choice. I think this is an extremely important problem. I don't know if it addresses your problem about consumerism. I mean, I do think. I mean, it is obvious that companies use a lot of trickery and stuff. If you ever seen a commercial to get you to buy things, and I think it's a problem, and it's probably very wasteful and stuff like that. But I'm glad you mentioned that.
Let's come back to you. JD, want to comment?
Yeah, so I guess I'm gonna maybe address what Ben said first on the topic of externalities. There's nothing really about capitalism, from my perspective anyway, that requires companies to externalize a lot of their pollution, environmental costs. I think that it certainly is the role of a thoughtful government to make sure that a real cost is reflected in something like the price of gasoline, but that doesn't mean price setting necessarily. It just means environmental legislation that forces something like pollution to be, the cost of pollution to be borne by a company and not by the public or the planet, in 200 years. But I don't think that addressing that problem doesn't necessarily mean departing from capitalism, but you're totally right to bring it up.
Well, to the extent that capitalism involves markets, I mean, it is a problem that is intrinsic to the market mechanism because markets don't know about social goods. I mean, markets, like there was a person who brought up the price of education in a privatized education system, for example. Markets don't realize that we would all be better off if we live in a society where everybody is educated. They don't realize that, so they just allocate the resource to the people who can pay for it.
Sure,
that is an intrinsic problem in markets.
But it's an adjustment to a price. Let's take, for example, a chemical company that generates some toxic waste. That's an easier thing to talk about than like CO2 emissions, but it's a similar, philosophically, it's a really similar problem. If I'm generating toxic waste and I'm selling my chemistry for like $1 an ounce, and I'm just dumping the toxic waste like in my backyard, I'm saving money by doing that, but a government would be completely within its rights to say, oh no, you have to dispose of that toxic waste in a way that doesn't like kill your neighbors. And here's a way you can do that. My price suddenly goes up to like $1.50 an ounce. And now that new price it's still set by the market, right? It's not a price setting thing. It's just that my costs are now a truer reflection of what it costs to produce what I'm making.
Sure, I would accept that. Yeah. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is there should be some kind of a corrective measure.
I totally agree.
If you're going to have a capitalist system. But I personally believe we should move beyond that to another kind of system that doesn't involve markets. But.
Any rebuttals to this agreement?
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, yeah, so I just wanted to mention, so I gave a Molotov Seminar a few weeks ago on this topic, so I won't repeat too much what I said, but as countries get wealthier, they do a lot of things. They become more efficient. So like China, or we actually produce about half the CO2 per dollar of GDP as China, as an example, or like many of the Eastern former Soviet countries, same thing. So countries become more efficient. They use less land to produce the same amount of food. They have fewer children. They start to care about the environment. This is why it's only really the developed places that forested land has actually started to increase in the last couple of years. And this is all these various things, but basically the point is that economic development and increasing wealth and increasing efficiency is probably the best thing you can do for the environment. As people get wealthier, they can live on fewer, maintain their standard of living with fewer resources, and they care about it. They'll actually like work to protect it. Like when you're really poor and like you're living at subsistence level, you don't really care about the environment. That's why like people actually start this ecotourism. Basically, you go to a place with a rich environment where people can pay the people not to burn down the rainforest.
Did you have a comment, Lal?
Yeah, actually, to address the question you were asking, right, about consumerism, I think that.
Sorry. That's cool. We have to discuss the environment sometime. Get back to consumerism.
I think that from what I've heard and what Ben told me about the model that he proposes, actually, that wouldn't be a problem there. It wouldn't be demand mainly driven by offer, right? But like the need to produce, to create demand, right? It would be more of an equitative system. This is actually very interesting. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the one thing I guess I would add, which maybe more directly addresses your point, as I understand the history of it, what basically happened to lead to all this rampant consumerism of kind of ridiculous products like Axe body spray and all this stuff. So as I understand the history of it, there was the Great Depression, right? The system collapsed, and various measures were tried to get out of it. There were the New Deal measures that were tried to get out of it. You could argue, I mean, certainly you can debate probably all night about that. I think personally there probably just weren't big enough efforts, and I think there's evidence for that because once World War II came along, the government started spending huge amounts of money, and that's one of the, I mean, before that, that drove a lot of like industrial production, and the way that I understand it, after the war, Some of that industrial production, you know, in order to kind of maintain the actual industry, had to be directed into other channels. And so they began to produce other things. And how do you get people to buy things? You know, you have to advertise it to them. I mean, if it's something that they don't necessarily need or want all by themselves, I mean, like, there are plenty of things that are available that it would never occur to me to purchase unless I saw an ad or something that might have convinced me to buy it or whatever. But that's, as I understand the history of it, I think that kind of might be where it comes from.
A short response from either of you?
Yeah, I guess maybe I almost want to quibble with the idea that consumerism is inherently bad. I do think that there's kind of an excess of frivolous crap out there, but I would argue that maybe that's a side effect of the fact that a good chunk of the market is trying really hard to think of stuff that we might want. And like, maybe it's not a shake weight or like a ShamWow or a slap chop, but like, I don't know, there are a bunch of apps out there that sound super frivolous, but that we probably all have installed on our smartphones. And even smartphones and stuff like that are things that when they first came out were almost certainly labeled as like, you know, excessively consumer-oriented, like kind of unproductive branches of the market that weren't making our world a better place. But now I think probably like at least 95% of the people in this room have a smartphone in their pocket and use it like 20 times a day. So I think that consumerism, when it's damaging to the consumer, is bad, but it's also a symptom of a society that's innovating as hard as it can. So not always bad.
Okay. One last question.
So for the last 10 years, U.S. government, or, you know, arguably, I was born in 1991. I like to say we've been at war my whole life. How much does the current U.S. system, which I like to call global corporate capitalism, impact our foreign policy?
How is that directly relevant to this as an alternative to capitalism or not? In what sense do you mean to frame that question?
Do you believe that capitalism is running our foreign policy?
Would any of you want to comment on that?
I mean, so our foreign policy is affected by quite a lot of things. A lot of them, I think, are social, sort of like not entirely unrelated, but mostly orthogonal to capitalism in particular. I will say that there's sort of an expression, no two countries which have McDonald's have ever gone to war. It's not literally true, but you can count the exceptions on probably one or two, maybe two hands. And this has been this long-running trend since the end of World War II, where major industrialized countries don't go to war with each other. It's just generally not a thing that happens. They've done like maybe proxy wars, or where like, you know, they're fighting other smaller countries, like we're fighting Iraq or terrorist groups that they don't really have a specific country, or we fought against the Soviet Union in a place like Vietnam. But generally, you actually have, as you have this sort of trade and industry, war becomes very expensive. It is expensive, but if we were to like go to war with another major industrialized country, the amount of damage that can be done would be incredible. You know, mutually assured destruction, even without nuclear weapons. You know, if we try to go to war with Europe, both places would probably be devastated, or at least Europe would. Joking aside, I think an actual capitalism, like you don't have this big government with the ability to wage lots of wars. Rather, you have people who individually trade with each other, and this is much more profitable. I mean, capitalism encourages trade. If you go to war, that's destructive and expensive. You trade, that's very positive.
Yeah, response.
This, I think this is an important question. I think it's true that it's probably not cost effective to take our military and go and try to open up markets and spread capitalism by force. But there is overwhelming evidence that we have done this in a kind of secret, covert way again and again and again. Okay, one of the first examples was Guatemala in 1953. It was a democratically elected government, and the U.S. government supported efforts to overthrow that government. And this was specifically for market reasons. This was specifically for reasons of like ownership of the land and the ability to grow crops and
I
things
believe
like that.
that's where the phrase banana republic comes
Exactly.
from.
It also happened in Chile, and this this is actually known as the first 9/11, 1973. The democratically elected government, a leftist government, it's a kind of a socialist government, Salvador Allende, there was a very vicious, brutal military attack. I mean, it was carried out by the Chilean military, not the U.S. government, but it was supported by the CIA. And this was, again, explicitly for the purpose of instituting free market policies in that country. And in fact, it was done with the help of the Chicago Boys. They were actually there advising the actual dictatorship that came into power. It also happened in Iran in the 1950s.
Last comments, Ben. Last comments.
It also happened in Iran in the 1950s. They overthrew a democratically elected government, and again, it was about oil. So, I mean, you don't have to use the military to open up markets, but it can. But it has affected our foreign policy.
Okay, so with that, I think we've had a lot of questions. I see a few more, but let's delve into later. We'd like to give all the speakers time for closing statements, if they would like. Take a minute and a half, each one to speak. Who wants to go first? Alex?
Am I starting?
Yep.
Okay, so I don't have much time. So, yeah, like I said, it goes back to the things I said at the beginning of information and incentives and not confusing. All of what I connect is this theme of not confusing capitalism with things that have been done by governments. I mean, I can address a few, just running these are the points, environment, something that I think capitalism is good for. Inequality, I think, is overblown. It's something you don't have to worry about that much. Solution to externalities. So this is what I recognize. If you really want to know about market, because people have written a lot about market solutions to externalities, recommend David Friedman's book, Machinery of Freedom. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, a lot of people have proposed different ways the market can deal with these externality issues, because they do exist, but again, I don't think that just because you come up with this, there's an externality. Okay, well, great. Does your system improve overall? Does your cost-benefit analysis say that implementing X policies X, Y, and Z will on average improve things? Like just because you have something that's not perfect doesn't mean you have something that's better. There's a French saying, le meilleur, le mieux du bon. The better or the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Okay, that was Alex. Maho, any thoughts?
Well, I like.
Mike, please.
Yeah, and like what Alex just said, I do believe that inequalities are a big problem, and I do believe that they do concentrate. Concentration of wealth does tend to become bigger and bigger, and that actually does have effect on other parts of society, and not just in terms of, as what Ben was saying, perception, individual health, whatnot, but also in terms of political power and what we were discussing after. So I mean, I'm not entirely sure if there's probably a better, if the alternative to capitalism if regulating capitalism would probably be one of the few things that we could do, that it's, I definitely think that regulating capitalism is a good thing, and I hope that we could actually eventually go to something more similar to what Ben says, but yeah, I mean, it's a different, hard road to go through, and I mean, you'd say they certainly have to lay down the path and specifically say how to go around that.
Jim.
No.
Okay, so I think that we all kind of agree that extreme poverty and extreme inequality are not desirable features of any society, or most of us agree on that. I don't think that any ideal economic system should lead to like hugely rich fat guys sitting in the tops of towers and then like a rabble all around the tower that can barely eat. And that's the common kind of cartoon version of capitalism, but I think that the essential engine of capitalism, which is private citizens with private wealth making individual decisions in the economy that are the individual decisions that suit their interests best, is a really powerful engine for optimizing prices and resource allocation and labor and services. And it may not be the best system in a teeny tiny little economy where a few smart people could get together and think of the ideal distribution for all these things, but in a global economy, which we unavoidably participate in today, you have to kind of crowdsource this efficiency optimization. And the only way I know of to do that is by letting each individual actor make his or her own economical decisions. And on top of that, you gotta keep people from getting super rich or super poor. Thanks.
Ben.
Is this on? Hello. Okay. I didn't really think through what I wanted to say very much for my closing remarks, but I guess, what I originally talked about was, I think democracy is something that we should aim for. Whether it's Paracon or whatever it is, I think we should aim for greater democratic control over things. Things change. I mean, the world, a couple of hundred years ago, there'd never been an example of a large-scale political democracy in world history, not once. But now they're all over the place. Many countries are democratic. I mean, I'm talking about formal democracy. That's not the same as effective democracy. But now they exist. And feudal societies, monarchies, they went on for centuries and centuries before they were finally challenged or overthrown or whatever it is, and gave way to something different. Capitalism is a pretty young system. I mean, it hasn't even been around for more than a couple of centuries. That may seem like a long time, that may make it feel like it's an inevitable system, but that doesn't mean it's inevitable. It doesn't mean it can't be changed. It doesn't mean that there isn't something else possible. You may not have been able to imagine a democracy a couple of hundred years ago. People might have said political democracy is too inefficient. How are you going to get people to come together and make a decision? That's crazy. I think we should take seriously the idea that it is possible to arrange these things in a democratic way. If for no other reason than to try to ensure that there's going to be a future, because the rate we're going, we're wrecking the environment and basically destroying the basis for our own survival. So I think we really should aim for some kind of greater democracy in these processes.
Okay, please, thanks for all the speakers. So I think that brings to a close the debate today. I saw a lot more questions, and I see follow-up questions and people waiting to have discussions. So feel free to chat with the speakers later, or you can post all your questions on the Facebook group. That does have a few discussions now and then.
I think Crown Anchor is still open.
Crown Anchor is open, and Jamie's probably heading there since he didn't go there before. So please feel free to engage. If you'd like to give a talk, get in touch with Neil. And any comments or feedback on the debate or what you'd like to discuss in the next debate, if you'd like to be a speaker, all of those are welcome. Please feel free to get in touch. Thank you for coming today.